My professor said, "Students from your background rarely succeed in academia." I thanked him for his honesty. That semester, I quietly compiled his published research. Graduation week, the dean called him in first. The dean's assistant called me at 7:42 a.m. on a Thursday morning in May, 3 days before graduation. I was in my apartment, the one I'd been sharing with 2 other graduate students for 4 years, eating cereal from a chipped bowl I'd bought at Goodwill when I first moved to Cambridge. She said Dr. Whitmore wanted to see me at 9 o'clock sharp. Something about my dissertation committee. Her voice was careful, professional, the kind of tone people use when they're reading from a script. I said I'd be there. Then I sat at my kitchen table for exactly 12 minutes, watching the milk in my cereal go warm, and I smiled. Not because I was happy, because I knew exactly what that meeting was about. I'd been waiting for it for 18 months. The folder was already in my bag, the one I carried everywhere, the one containing 847 pages of documentation that would end Dr. Raymond Ashworth's 32-year career at one of the most prestigious universities in the country. I finished my cereal. I showered. I put on the only suit I owned, the one my mother had sent me money for when I'd been accepted to the doctoral program, money she'd saved from working double shifts at the textile plant in Garner, North Carolina. And I walked to the dean's office feeling something I hadn't felt in 4 years. Peace. I need to go back to explain how I got there. How a kid from a town with 1 stoplight and no bookstore ended up in the mahogany-paneled office of an Ivy League dean with evidence that would destroy one of the most celebrated economists in American academia. The truth is, I almost didn't make it at all. I grew up in Garner, population 2,300, the kind of place where people worked at the plant or they didn't work at all. My father left when I was 7. My mother raised me and my 2 younger sisters on $11.50 an hour and sheer determination. We lived in a house that had been my grandmother's, 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a roof that leaked when it rained hard. I was good at school. Not just good, exceptional. By the time I was 12, I'd read every book in our tiny public library. By 14, I was taking online college courses because my high school didn't offer anything challenging enough. By 16, I'd scored a perfect 1,600 on the SAT, which made the local newspaper run a story about me. Small-town genius aims for the stars. I still have the clipping somewhere. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Dolores Franklin, a woman who'd been advising students for 28 years, told me I could go anywhere. She helped me apply to schools I'd only seen in movies. When the acceptance letter came from the university, I remember my mother crying at the kitchen table. Full scholarship, room and board, books and fees. Everything covered. It felt like winning the lottery. It felt like escape. It felt like proof that the American dream wasn't just a story they told poor kids to keep them quiet. I arrived on campus in August, 18 years old, carrying 2 suitcases and a backpack full of notebooks. The other students had parents helping them move in, SUVs packed with mini fridges and designer bedding. I had a bus ticket and $200 in cash that my mother had pressed into my hand at the station. "Don't let anyone make you feel small," she'd said. "You belong there as much as anyone." I believed her. I was wrong. The first week was disorienting. The buildings were older than my entire town. The dining hall served food I couldn't pronounce. The other students talked about gap years in Europe and summer internships at their parents' firms. I talked about working at the Dairy Queen and helping my mother with the electric bill. People were polite, but I could feel the distance, the invisible wall between us. I told myself it didn't matter. I was there to learn, not to make friends. I threw myself into my classes, economics, statistics, political theory. I loved it all, but economics captured me completely. The idea that you could use mathematics to understand human behavior, to predict outcomes, to design systems that actually helped people. I wanted to understand poverty the way a doctor understands disease. I wanted to find cures. By the end of my first year, I had a 4.0 GPA and a reputation as the kid who lived in the library. By the end of my second year, 3 professors had encouraged me to consider graduate school. By the end of my third year, I'd published my first paper, a small piece in an undergraduate journal about wage stagnation in rural manufacturing communities. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it was mine. The summer before my senior year, I attended a lecture that changed everything. Dr. Raymond Ashworth was speaking about his latest book, The Economics of Opportunity. He was everything I thought a scholar should be. Distinguished gray hair, tweed jacket with leather elbow patches, a voice that commanded the room without ever raising above conversational. His research focused on social mobility, on how economic policies could either trap people in poverty or lift them out of it. He'd advised 3 presidential administrations. He'd won the university's highest teaching award 4 times. His papers were cited thousands of times. He was, by every measure, a giant in the field, and his work spoke to me personally. He wrote about people like my mother, like my neighbors in Garner, like everyone I'd grown up watching struggle against systems designed to keep them struggling. After the lecture, I introduced myself. I told him about my background, my interests, my dream of pursuing a doctorate focused on rural economic development. He listened with what seemed like genuine interest. "Fascinating," he said. "We need more voices like yours in academia, people who understand poverty from the inside, not just the outside." He gave me his card, told me to email him, said he'd be happy to discuss my graduate school options. I floated home that night. Here was a man who got it, who valued what I'd lived through, who could help me turn my experience into scholarship that actually mattered. I emailed him the next day. He responded within hours. We met for coffee, then for lunch, then for a series of informal mentoring sessions where he reviewed my writing, suggested readings, and eventually offered to write my primary letter of recommendation for graduate school. Dr. Ashworth's recommendation letter was glowing. I know because he showed it to me, which I later learned was unusual. He called me one of the most promising students I've encountered in 3 decades of teaching, and a young man whose personal journey embodies the very questions our field seeks to answer. I was accepted to every doctoral program I applied to. I chose to stay at the university because Ashworth was there. He agreed to chair my dissertation committee. It felt like destiny. The first red flag came in September of my first year as a doctoral student. I was in Ashworth's office, discussing potential dissertation topics, when another student knocked on the door. Her name was Priya Venkatesh, a third-year student I'd seen around the department but hadn't really talked to. She needed Ashworth's signature on some paperwork. He signed without looking, then turned back to me as she left. "Be careful with that one," he said, voice low. "Comes from money. Never had to work for anything. These legacy students think a famous last name entitles them to success." I nodded, uncomfortable but not sure why. It seemed like an odd thing to say. Priya seemed perfectly nice, but I told myself Ashworth knew the department better than I did. Maybe there was history I wasn't aware of. A week later, he made a similar comment about another student, James Okoro, a second year from Chicago. "Affirmative action admit," Ashworth muttered after James left a seminar. "The university lowers standards for diversity, and we all pretend not to notice." My stomach tightened. James was brilliant. His questions in seminars were always the sharpest in the room. But I didn't say anything. Ashworth was my mentor, my champion, the man who'd believed in me when I was just a kid from nowhere. I told myself I'd misheard, or misunderstood, or that he'd meant something different than what it sounded like. The second red flag came in November. I was working late in the graduate student office when Ashworth stopped by. He did that sometimes, checking on his students, offering feedback, playing the role of accessible mentor. We talked about my research, about the courses I was taking, about the job market. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with something that felt like appraisal. "You know, Michael," he said, using my first name for the first time, "students from your background rarely succeed in academia." I felt the words land like a physical blow, but I kept my face neutral. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean the statistics. First-generation students, rural students, students without family wealth or connections. The dropout rate is staggering. The academic job market is brutal. Most of them end up leaving with massive debt and no career prospects." He shook his head, looking almost sad. "I'm not saying this to discourage you. I'm saying it because I believe in honesty. You need to understand the odds you're facing." I sat there for a long moment, feeling something cold settle in my chest. Then I did something that surprised us both. I thanked him. "I appreciate your honesty, Dr. Ashworth," I said. "It's good to know what I'm up against." He smiled, apparently pleased by my mature response. "That's why I like you, Michael. You're not fragile like most of these kids. You understand reality." He left. I sat in the empty office until midnight, staring at the wall, replaying his words. "Students from your background rarely succeed. Your background. Not your ability, not your work ethic, not your ideas. Your background." That was the night something shifted. I didn't stop respecting Ashworth's scholarship. I didn't stop wanting to learn from him. But I started watching him differently, started listening to what he said and who he said it about, started keeping notes. The third red flag came in February. I was helping Ashworth organize research materials for a new paper he was writing about educational mobility. He'd asked me to pull data from several sources, including census records, Department of Education statistics, and previous academic studies, standard research assistant work. But as I compiled the data, something bothered me. The numbers in his draft didn't match what I was finding, not dramatically different, but consistently off in ways that strengthened his argument. A study showing 12% improvement became 18% in his citation. A sample size of 2,400 became 3,100. Small changes, but they added up. I assumed I'd made an error. Ashworth was one of the most respected researchers in the field. His work was cited by policymakers, by journalists, by other academics. Surely someone would have noticed if his data was wrong. I rechecked my sources, then rechecked again. The discrepancies remained. I brought it up to him, carefully, framing it as my own confusion. "Dr. Ashworth, I'm having trouble matching some of these figures to the original sources. Could you point me to where you found the 18% improvement rate? The study I'm looking at says 12%. He barely glanced up from his computer. "Different methodological approach. I'm using adjusted figures that account for sampling bias in the original study." I nodded, wrote it down, went back to work. But the explanation didn't make sense. You don't adjust someone else's published findings. You cite what they found and note your methodological disagreements. That night, I started a new document on my personal laptop. I titled it Questions. I copied every discrepancy I'd noticed, Every figure that didn't match, every citation that seemed slightly off. It was probably nothing. Probably just my own inexperience, my unfamiliarity with how elite research actually worked. But Mrs. Franklin had taught me something back in Garner, something I'd never forgotten. Trust your instincts, she'd said. If something feels wrong, it usually is. The fourth red flag came in April, and it wasn't subtle. Ashworth invited me to a dinner at his home, a beautiful Victorian in the nicest part of town. His wife, Eleanor, was warm and gracious. His 2 adult children, both successful professionals, were visiting from New York. It felt like being welcomed into a world I'd never known existed. After dinner, Ashworth took me to his study for whiskey. The walls were lined with awards, framed photos with politicians and celebrities, first editions of books that belonged in museums. "Michael," he said, swirling his glass, "I want you to understand something. The Academy is not a meritocracy. It never has been." I waited. The students who succeed are the ones who understand how the game is played. They publish in the right journals. They attend the right conferences. They build relationships with the right people. Raw talent is necessary but not sufficient. He leaned forward. "I can help you navigate this. I can open doors that would otherwise remain closed. But you need to be loyal. You need to understand that my success is your success. That when you help my research, you help yourself." I nodded slowly, trying to parse what he was really saying. "What kind of help do you mean?" I asked. "Data collection, analysis, writing, the tedious work that takes time away from my more important projects." He smiled. "Don't worry, you'll be properly credited. Co-authorship on papers that will launch your career." It sounded generous. It sounded like exactly what a struggling first-generation student needed. But something about the way he said loyal made my skin crawl. Loyalty to what, exactly? To him personally? To his research agenda? To his version of reality, where some data could be adjusted and students from certain backgrounds could be written off before they even started? By the end of my first year, I had a clear picture of who Raymond Ashworth really was. In public, he was the champion of social mobility, the economist who cared about the poor. In private, he was something else entirely. A man who categorized people by their backgrounds and made judgments before they'd proven anything. A man who expected loyalty in exchange for access. A man whose research, I was increasingly certain, contained systematic errors that weren't errors at all. That summer, I made a decision that would consume the next 3 years of my life. I would verify every major claim in Raymond Ashworth's published work. Every data point, every citation, every figure and table. If I was wrong, if my instincts were off, I would know for certain. And if I was right, I would have proof. I started with his most famous paper, Pathways Out of Poverty, published 14 years earlier in the American Economic Review. It had been cited over 4,000 times. It formed the basis of his entire academic reputation. The paper argued that specific policy interventions, targeted educational grants, job training subsidies, and microfinance programs could dramatically increase social mobility in rural communities. It used data from a longitudinal study of 1,200 families across 12 Appalachian counties over 15 years. The results were striking. Families that received the interventions showed 340% greater income growth than control families. Children from intervention families were 2.8 times more likely to complete college. The poverty rate in intervention communities dropped by 41% compared to 12% in control communities. It was exactly the kind of research that policymakers loved. Clear interventions, dramatic results, a blueprint for solving one of America's most intractable problems. It was also, I discovered over the next 6 months, almost entirely fabricated. The first problem was the data. Ashworth claimed to have conducted a 15-year longitudinal study, but I couldn't find any record of the study in the standard databases. No registration, no IRB approval documentation, no acknowledgement of funding sources. I requested the raw data through the university's data sharing protocol, the process that allows researchers to verify each other's findings. Ashworth's office said the data was proprietary and couldn't be shared due to privacy concerns about the families involved. That was unusual but not necessarily suspicious. Some researchers do protect subject privacy carefully. But then I started checking the citations. Ashworth referenced 43 external sources in the paper. I tracked down all of them. 18 didn't say what he claimed they said. 7 were cited incorrectly in ways that changed their meaning, and 3 didn't exist at all. I spent 2 weeks trying to find a study by Pearson and Wright, 1994, about rural educational outcomes in eastern Kentucky. It wasn't in any database. It wasn't in any library archive. I contacted the journal where it was supposedly published. They had no record of it. I contacted researchers named Pearson, who worked on education policy in that era. None of them had co-authored anything with anyone named Wright. The citation was a ghost, a made-up source to support a made-up finding. I documented everything. Screen captures of database searches, correspondence with journals and researchers, side-by-side comparisons of what Ashworth's papers claimed versus what the original sources actually said. I created a spreadsheet with every discrepancy I found, color-coded by severity. Green for minor misquotations, yellow for significant misrepresentations, red for outright fabrications. By December of my second year, the spreadsheet had 312 entries. 89 of them were red. I wasn't eating properly. I wasn't sleeping. My own dissertation work had stalled because every spare moment went into this parallel investigation. My roommates thought I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. But I couldn't stop. The more I found, the more I needed to find. Ashworth's second most cited paper, published in 2011, claimed to show that minimum wage increases had no negative effect on rural employment. His data came from a survey of small businesses in the Mississippi Delta. Except 3 of the counties he named didn't match any actual geography in Mississippi. I pulled census records, business registration databases, state economic development reports. The counties Ashworth described, with the population figures and industry compositions he specified, didn't exist. He'd made them up. The entire study was built on fictional places. In my 3rd year, I found something that made me physically ill. Ashworth had published a paper in 2018, just before I'd arrived as a graduate student, about the effectiveness of a job training program in rural North Carolina. The paper praised the program's outcomes and recommended its expansion to other states. The study site was a county called Garner, my county, the county where I grew up. The paper described a program I'd never heard of, run by an organization that had no presence in my hometown, producing outcomes that contradicted everything I knew about my community's economic reality. Ashworth claimed that 450 participants had gone through the program between 2015 and 2017, with 78% finding stable employment within 6 months. I called my mother. I called Mrs. Franklin. I called the County Economic Development Office, the Mayor's Office, the Chamber of Commerce. Nobody knew anything about a job training program matching Ashworth's description. The organization he named, the Appalachian Opportunity Foundation, had no website, no registration with the state, no tax records, nothing. I sat in my apartment that night, staring at the paper, and I understood something for the first time. Raymond Ashworth hadn't just fabricated data. He'd built his entire career on lies, and he'd done it by writing about communities that didn't have the resources to check his work, about people like my mother, about places like my home. He'd used our poverty as raw material for his fiction, and he'd gotten rich and famous doing it. The anger I felt was unlike anything I'd experienced before, cold, clarifying, permanent. I knew I couldn't go public on my own. A 3rd-year doctoral student accusing a legendary professor of fraud would be destroyed. Ashworth had connections everywhere, on the editorial boards of top journals, on government advisory panels, on the university's board of trustees. If I came forward without institutional backing, I would be portrayed as a troubled student with a grudge, mentally unstable, desperate for attention. My career would be over before it started. So I found allies. The first was Dr. Amira Nasser, an associate professor of statistics who'd joined the university 2 years earlier. She was an expert in research methodology and data verification. She'd published several papers on replication failures in economics research. She was also, I'd heard through departmental gossip, quietly skeptical of some of the field's most celebrated scholars. I approached her after a seminar in January of my 4th year. I told her I was working on a methodological project examining data practices in published research. I asked if she'd be willing to review some of my findings. She agreed. I gave her Ashworth's papers without telling her they were Ashworth's, just the data claims and my verification notes. 3 weeks later, she called me to her office. "Where did you get these?" she asked, voice tight. I told her. She was quiet for a long time. "You understand what you're suggesting?" It wasn't a question. "I understand what the evidence shows." She nodded slowly. "If this is real, if even half of what you've documented is accurate, it's one of the largest cases of academic fraud in the history of the discipline." She paused. "It would also destroy your career. His defenders will come after you with everything they have." I'd thought about that for months. "My career doesn't matter if the field I'm entering is built on lies." Dr. Nasser became my first ally, but not my last. She introduced me to Dr. Theodore Kim, a data scientist at MIT who specialized in forensic analysis of research datasets. She connected me with Dr. Lillian Okonkwo, a professor at Stanford who'd been quietly investigating irregularities in economics research for years. She put me in touch with David Mercer, a journalist at the New York Times who covered academic misconduct. Over the next year, we built a case. Dr. Kim used statistical techniques to analyze the patterns in Ashworth's data. His findings were damning. The datasets showed signs of what researchers call too good to be true syndrome, results that were suspiciously perfect, with none of the noise and messiness that characterizes real-world data. The probability that Ashworth's published results were generated by actual field research was, according to Kim's analysis, less than 1 in 10 million. Dr. Okonkwo contacted researchers who'd worked with Ashworth over the years. 3 former graduate students, speaking anonymously, confirmed that Ashworth had pressured them to clean up data that didn't support his conclusions. One said he'd left academia entirely because of what he'd witnessed. Another said she'd tried to report concerns years ago, but had been told by university administration to drop it. The university, it seemed, had known there were problems. They'd chosen to protect their star. David Mercer, the journalist, tracked down the communities Ashworth had studied. He visited the counties in Appalachia and the Mississippi Delta. He talked to local officials, business owners, residents. He found what I had found, that many of Ashworth's study sites were fictional, his participants non-existent, his findings invented. By March of my 4th year, we had everything. 847 pages of documentation. Statistical analysis from 3 independent experts. On-the-record statements from former colleagues and graduate students. Documentary evidence from affected communities. A pattern of fraud spanning 20 years and touching nearly every major publication on Raymond Ashworth's CV. We also had a strategy. Dr. Nasser would file a formal complaint with the university's Office of Research Integrity. David Mercer would publish his investigation simultaneously, ensuring the university couldn't bury the complaint. I would submit a supplementary report to the graduate school, documenting my own findings and requesting a formal investigation. The timing had to be perfect. If we moved too early, Ashworth's allies could mobilize to discredit us. If we moved too late, the story might leak and give him time to prepare a defense. We chose graduation week, the one week when the university would be filled with media attention, when any attempt to suppress the story would be immediately visible, when every trustee and major donor would be on campus watching. The night before we moved, I sat in my apartment and read through my entire file one more time. 3 years of work, 3 years of quiet investigation while smiling in Ashworth's office, pretending to be his grateful protege, nodding along as he made comments about students from certain backgrounds. I'd played the role perfectly. He had no idea what was coming. At 11:47 p.m., I got a text from Dr. Nasser. Filed. Good luck. At 6:15 a.m., the New York Times published David Mercer's investigation. The headline was brutal. Ivy League star built career on fabricated research, investigation finds. By 7 a.m., the story was trending on social media. By 7:30 a.m., the university had released a statement announcing an emergency investigation. By 7:42 a.m., the dean's assistant called me. Something about my dissertation committee. I knew exactly what it meant. Ashworth was my committee chair. If he was being investigated, my entire doctoral program was thrown into chaos. But I also knew something else. The dean didn't just want to discuss logistics. He wanted to know what I knew. I arrived at the administration building at 8:53 a.m. The campus was buzzing with graduation preparations, but clusters of people were standing around staring at their phones. I heard Ashworth's name spoken 3 times before I reached the dean's office. Inside, Dr. Charles Whitmore was waiting. He was 62 years old, former economics professor himself, dean of the graduate school for 11 years, a careful political man who'd built his career on avoiding controversy. Today, he looked like someone had told him the building was on fire. "Mr. Reed," he said, "please sit down." I sat. "I assume you've seen the news." I nodded. "Dr. Ashworth has been suspended pending investigation. Given that he chairs your dissertation committee, we need to discuss the implications for your degree." He paused, watching me carefully. "We also need to discuss your role in what's happening." I'd prepared for this moment, rehearsed what I would say, how I would frame it. The truth, but strategically revealed. "Dr. Whitmore, I've spent the past 3 years documenting irregularities in Dr. Ashworth's research. I have comprehensive files that I believe the investigation will find relevant." I placed the folder on his desk. 847 pages. Color-coded spreadsheets, correspondence, analysis. "I'm prepared to cooperate fully with any inquiry." Whitmore looked at the folder like it might bite him. "You're telling me you've been investigating your own advisor for 3 years?" "Yes, sir. While he supervised your work, wrote your recommendations, guided your career." "Yes, sir." He was silent for a long moment. "Why?" I thought about my mother working double shifts, about Mrs. Franklin believing in a kid from nowhere, about Ashworth's voice saying students from your background rarely succeed. "Because he was lying about people like me," I said, building his reputation on fictional studies of communities he'd never visited, people he'd never met, using our poverty as decoration for his career while telling us to our faces that we didn't belong here. I kept my voice steady. Someone had to check his work. I was in a position to do it. The investigation took 6 weeks. The university assembled an independent committee of researchers from other institutions. They reviewed my documentation, Dr. Kim's statistical analysis, Dr. Okonkwo's interviews, Mercer's reporting. They contacted journals where Ashworth had published, requesting raw data and methodology files. Most of the journals had never asked for that information. They'd trusted Ashworth's reputation. The findings were worse than anyone had expected. Of the 43 papers Ashworth had published in peer-reviewed journals over his career, 31 contained significant fabrication or falsification. 14 were based on studies that had never been conducted at all. The longitudinal study in Appalachia, the basis of his most famous work, was entirely fictional. No families had been tracked. No interventions had been tested. No data had been collected. He'd made up everything: the participants, the locations, the results. The committee estimated that at least $12 million in federal grants had been awarded based on Ashworth's fraudulent research. Policy decisions at the state and federal level had been influenced by his findings. Other researchers had built their careers on his foundation of lies. The contamination spread through the entire field. On July 14th, the university announced its conclusions. Dr. Raymond Ashworth was terminated for cause, stripped of his emeritus status, and banned from campus. The university requested formal retractions from every journal where he'd published. His name was removed from the building that had been named after him following a major donation 15 years earlier. A donation, the investigation revealed, that had come from a foundation whose board included 3 former students who'd benefited from inflated grades and falsified recommendation letters. The story dominated academic news for weeks. Ashworth initially tried to defend himself, claiming he was the victim of a vendetta by jealous colleagues. He hired a lawyer. He gave interviews to sympathetic outlets. He suggested that the investigation was politically motivated, an attack on his conservative approach to social policy. None of it worked. The evidence was too comprehensive. Too many former students came forward with stories of coerced data manipulation. Too many communities confirmed that his studies had never happened. Too many experts verified that his numbers were statistically impossible. In August, faced with potential federal fraud charges related to the grant money, Ashworth negotiated a settlement. He admitted to significant methodological errors in his research. He agreed to return $2.8 million to federal funding agencies. He surrendered his professional licenses and memberships. He would never work in academia again. I graduated in September, 3 months late due to the committee reorganization. Dr. Nasser agreed to chair my dissertation committee. 3 other faculty members joined, all of them committed to research integrity, all of them determined to help me finish what I'd started. My dissertation examined the real economic conditions in rural Appalachian communities, using actual data, verified methodology, and transparent practices. I visited the communities Ashworth had claimed to study. I met the families whose experiences he'd invented. I documented what their lives were actually like, the challenges they faced, the policies that helped, and the ones that didn't. It wasn't as dramatic as Ashworth's fabricated findings. Real research rarely is. But it was true. The job market was brutal, just as Ashworth had warned me years ago. First-generation students from rural backgrounds did face long odds in academia, but I had something most candidates didn't have: a reputation. The New York Times story mentioned my role in uncovering the fraud. David Mercer wrote a follow-up piece specifically about my 3-year investigation. Academic Twitter, for all its chaos, celebrated me as the graduate student who'd taken down a giant. I received interview invitations from 12 universities. I accepted a position at a small liberal arts college in Vermont, a place that valued teaching and mentorship and genuine engagement with students. Not as prestigious as the university I'd left, not as famous, but honest. On my last day of campus, I walked past the building that used to bear Ashworth's name. Workmen were removing the letters, leaving ghostly outlines where they'd hung for 15 years. A group of undergraduates passed by, laughing about something on their phones, not even noticing the historical moment happening above them. I thought about Mrs. Franklin, who'd sent me a card when the story broke. "I always knew you'd do something important," she'd written. "I just didn't know it would be this important." I thought about my mother, who'd cried when I told her what I'd found about the Garner study. "He used us," she'd said. "He used our whole town to make himself look good." I thought about Ashworth, wherever he was now, stripped of everything he'd built, knowing that his legacy would be defined not by his awards or his influence, but by the magnitude of his lies. And I thought about his words, spoken in a graduate student office 4 years earlier. "Students from your background rarely succeed in academia." He was right, in a way. Most students from my background don't succeed. The systems are stacked against us. The odds are terrible. The barriers are real. But he was wrong about why. He thought we failed because we weren't good enough, because we lacked some essential quality that the privileged possessed, because our backgrounds made us lesser. The truth is simpler and sadder. We fail because people like Raymond Ashworth pretend to care about us while building their careers on our backs. We fail because the gatekeepers of knowledge sometimes turn out to be frauds. We fail because nobody checks the work of the powerful, and the powerful know it. I didn't succeed despite my background. I succeeded because of it. Because I came from a place where people work hard for little reward, where lies have consequences, where you learn to spot a con artist by necessity. Ashworth saw my history as a disadvantage. He was wrong. It was the only advantage that mattered. I'm a professor now. 3 years in Vermont, teaching economics to students who remind me of myself. Some of them come from money, some don't. All of them get the same thing from me: honesty about how hard the path is, support to walk it anyway, and a commitment to truth that doesn't bend for convenience or reputation. Last spring, a first-year student came to my office hours. She was from a town in West Virginia even smaller than Garner. She'd gotten a scholarship, worked her way to campus, felt completely out of place among her wealthy classmates. "Professor Reed," she said, "do people like me actually make it in this field?" I thought about everything I could tell her: the statistics, the challenges, the systemic barriers, the ways the academy still favors the privileged. All of it true, all of it incomplete. "Some people will tell you that you don't belong here," I said. "They might even show you data to prove it. My advice is simple: check their sources. People who underestimate you tend to be sloppy with the truth." She smiled. I smiled back. Then we got to work. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.